a few months ago, the Sega Dreamcast celebrated its 25th birthday with the ever so infamous release date of 9/9/1999. It's hard to believe, but this incredible console came out a quarter century ago. But regardless, it is still one of the best consoles to be released with some of my favorite titles. So in today's episode, we're going to be building an ultimate 25th anniversary edition of the console with some new mods and some old favorites. So let's dive in and take a look. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito, and I want to start off by wishing you all a happy holiday season. We're just coming off the Christmas festivities, so I hope you had an amazing one. And with that, welcome back to another episode of Retro Renew. Now, growing up, I was admittedly a Sega kid. My first video game console was a Model 2 Sega Genesis, followed very closely with a Sega Game Gear. I was just enamored with the sleek black design of their shells and what I perceived as technological superiority to the competition. They just looked so much cooler than the Nintendo offerings of the day, at least in my opinion. When the Sega Saturn was first announced, I desperately wanted one, but never had the chance to own it. Fast forward to 1999, when the Dreamcast was gearing up for its big debut, and I managed to convince Santa to bring me one for Christmas. And the rest, as they say, is history. Games like Sonic Adventure, Resident Evil Code Veronica, and of course, Shenmue completely captured my imagination and made me fall in love with what would ultimately become Sega's swan song in gaming hardware. I was fully in on the Dreamcast, with its sleek design, Microsoft approval, and of course that VMU, which, let's be honest, is pretty much a Game Boy, at least to the lofty imagination of my 13-year-old self. And I brought this thing absolutely everywhere with me, even though it didn't do all that much. Suffice it to say, the Dreamcast is one of my all-time favorite consoles. This right here is my original system that I got for Christmas in 1999. I absolutely cherish this thing. Now, previously on this channel, I've done a few videos covering some amazing kits for this console. And well, I think it's time to do a bit of an update to my previous Ultimate build because modders have been busy and some pretty cool and interesting new mods have entered the scene. Also, this particular Dreamcast model I have here is a bit unique. This is a VA0 system, the very first revision to roll off the Sega factory assembly line. Now, from the outside, it looks like any other system with no real outward-facing tells that this is a VA0 console. But once we take this thing apart, it starts to become clear that this is a special unit. The first tell we can see as soon as we remove the top shell is this metal heatsink here behind the fan. The more common VA1 models have a plastic fan and shroud in this location with no heatsink at all. But that's not the kicker. Further taking the system apart, we can see the entire cooling system, which is vastly different from some of the more common revisions of the Dreamcast. The Holly GPU and SH4 CPU have a heat block with heat pipes running through them that are connected to that heatsink. It's a pretty beefy cooling system, especially when you compare it to the VA1 revision, which simply relies on the upper RF shielding to dissipate the heat. Some say the VA0, which is an uncommon model, is better built than the other revisions of the console, and I can sort of see why with this unique cooling system. It must have cost Sega quite a bit more money to manufacture than these later revisions, which is why I presume Sega got rid of this style of cooling later on in the life of the Dreamcast. Anyway, this will serve as the base of our tricked out console, of which we'll be installing 6 mods, as well as some other upgrades for better overall performance. So sit back, relax, let me do all the work as I guide you through this build. Or feel free to skip around to the mods that most interest you, as I'll have the timestamps linked down below. So to start off, we'll need to prep the motherboard. The only thing we need to do here is remove the 2 heat blocks from the CPU and GPU and unplug the temperature sensor. These thermal pads are looking pretty old, so we'll be addressing them a bit later on. Anyway, with the cooling system off, we can do our first mod. Since I'll be installing the GDEMU, which is a fantastic optical drive emulator which allows us to load games off of an SD card, we actually need to remove some resistors from the motherboard and install some new ones. You see, the VA0 motherboard supplies 5 volts through this connector, which is the only revision to do this. The GDEMU we want to install actually runs off of 3.3 volts. Simply plugging the GDEMU into a VA0 console will likely damage the GDEMU itself, So we need to swap out a few resistors to adjust the voltage, which actually brings me to the sponsor of today's video, Hacko. As longtime viewers of the channel may or may not know, I've exclusively used Hacko soldering equipment for nearly the entire history of this channel. Hacko is world-renowned for its exceptional, reliable, and high-quality soldering equipment. Every piece of Hacko gear I use in my workshop, including the soldering station, desoldering gun, hot air station, and fume extractor, I've personally purchased with my own money. It's a true case of putting my money where my mouth is, and that alone speaks volumes about their outstanding quality and performance. Which is why I personally reached out to Hacko to see if they'd be interested in becoming a sponsor for the channel, because I genuinely believe and trust in their products. And thankfully they agreed. Not only that, but they sent over 2 of their FX888DX soldering stations for me to give away to you, the amazing viewers. They also sent me a third FX88DX for me to demonstrate its fantastic features and show you just how great it is by using it to install all the mods that I am featuring in this video. The FX888DX is a fantastic digital soldering station that's perfect for those just starting out on their modding journey. With an affordable price tag and a great set of features, the FX888 is the perfect companion for getting into the retro modding hobby. And like I said, it features digital temperature settings to give you precise control, as well as swappable T18 tips to get you through any modding scenario. And with the new DX lineup, it comes in 3 sweet colorways to match your bench setup. The kit includes the base station, the iron with a chisel tip, and a silver iron holder with cleaning sponge and tip cleaning wire. Everything you need to get started. To enter the giveaway, check out the instructions in the description below. And again, a huge thank you to Hacko for sponsoring this video. Alright, so back to where we left off, we need to replace some resistors on the Dreamcast motherboard, 7 in total, to adjust the voltage that the GDEMU will be getting from 5 volts all the way down to 3.3 volts. This 33 ohm resistor array here near the BIOS chip and these 6 here on the bottom of the motherboard need to be swapped out. We'll be replacing them with 100 ohm resistors, which will drop the voltage supplied to the GD-ROM drive connector from 5 volts to 3.3 volts. You can read more about this mod here on this thread on Obscure Gamers. I'll also leave a link to the 100 ohm resistor arrays that I'll be using for this mod, as well as all the other parts that I'll be using for this build down below in the video description. Removing these arrays is pretty easy. I'm just flooding the array on one side with some solder and then whisking them away. Once all the resistors are removed and with the pads all cleaned up, I'll go ahead and put in our new 100 ohm resistor array in their place. It doesn't really matter which way they go in, and while the pads are pretty small, just take your time making sure that they are aligned with the pads and use plenty of flux. You may also want to check your work with a multimeter to ensure that you're not bridging any of the pins. Fantastic, so now the motherboard is modified to run the GDEMU at 3.3 volts, which is great, so we don't have to worry about damaging anything. So we've got one mod down, but there's still plenty more to go. Up next, we'll be installing this custom BIOS chip, so I gotta give a huge shout out to Modsville USA for sending this over pre-configured and for being incredibly helpful, not just with this BIOS chip, but with all the insight on the resistor mod that we just completed. Definitely check out his store where you can find these pre-configured BIOS chips along with a ton of other awesome mod kits. I'll have that linked down below for you. So this chip here holds a specially modified BIOS that allows us to play import titles and do some other really cool things. Now you may be asking, if we're installing a GDEMU, which already allows us to play import titles, why do we need to change the BIOS chip? While enabling us to play import titles is one of its key features, there's actually one specific thing that this chip can do that I find super cool and admittedly kind of useless. But I'm going to keep that a surprise for now, so definitely stay tuned, and I'll showcase the quirky but awesome feature later on in the video. Anyway, to install the custom BIOS chip, we first need to remove the old one. I'm going to use my Hacko hot air machine and a bunch of flux to do this. I'm also using some Kapton tape with some tinfoil to help protect the surrounding components, especially the plastic GD-ROM connector from the hot air. We don't want to melt anything. Now this tool here is another handy product from Hacko that I use all the time, and it's a vacuum pickup tool, which makes grabbing these surface mounted components very easy, especially when using hot air to remove them. I get asked about this tool all the time, so again, I'm going to be leaving a link to it down below in the video description. Anyway, with the old chip removed, let's go ahead and install the new one, making sure the orientation is correct and slowly soldering each of the legs in. Now to make this new chip work, we actually also need to solder a wire from this pin here on the GD-ROM drive port to pin 1 on the BIOS. And we also need to bridge pin 23 and 44 together, giving us something that looks like this. This is what the new BIOS chip should look like when it's fully installed. Alright, 2 mods down, 4 more to go. Next, we're probably going to install the coolest mod of this entire build, and it's the all-new PixelFX HDMI kit. Now, I actually covered the legacy HDMI mod in another video called the DC Digital. This new one is called RetroGEM and actually has a few more features, which is why I'm excited to install it. One of which is a full-size HDMI port option, which is great because I really don't like those micro HDMI ports. So let's get into it and install it. First thing we need to do is actually remove this connector here, which is for the AV and serial port. According to Dan, one of the team members over at PixelFX, I should actually be able to remove this port by rocking it back and forth. Now remember, I'm a professional, so definitely do this at your own risk. Honestly, I'm cringing just watching myself attempt this. It feels like a textbook way to rip off all the pads. Using hot air would definitely be a safer approach here, but to my surprise, I managed to remove it without damaging any of the pads using Dan's rocking method. Anyway, here we need to make a decision because we can only keep one of the ports. I opted to keep the serial port since removing the larger AV port allows me to utilize the opening for that full-size HDMI port. If you don't mind the HDMI micro port, then you can remove the serial port instead. Now, after doing that, I'm going to go ahead and reconnect the serial port. And another unique thing about this kit is that the majority of the install occurs on the top of the motherboard, except this part here, which goes on the bottom. We need to install this piece here, which is the mount for the RetroGEM board itself. It goes here and is secured by these 2 points using solder. Now, this next part is the most difficult. It requires patience, a steady hand, and some major magnification. This is the flex ribbon cable that will be pulling the pure digital video and audio signals from the Dreamcast to give us crisp, lossless video and pipe it to our full-size HDMI port. Soldering this ribbon cable requires a significant degree of proficiency with soldering, and the ribbon cable itself appears to be very similar to the one that's used in the legacy DC Digital kit. There are a ton of different points that we need to solder to, so definitely take your time and be sure to review your work to ensure that all the joints are solid and that there is no bridging. I definitely would refer to the RetroGEM GitHub for guidance on all the points that need to be soldered to, as well as instructions and tips for the installation of the entire kit. But once it is installed, it should look like this. This is definitely the most challenging part of the mod and really of this entire build, but it's definitely worth it in the end. So once we have the ribbon installed, we can actually connect it to the GEM, and before we mount it, we do need to bridge some of these jumpers in order to properly configure the GEM for the Sega Dreamcast. You see, the GEM board is essentially a universal kit and is used across many different consoles, including the PS2, PS1, Nintendo 64, and very soon the GameCube and Nintendo Wii. I think these are coming out in about a month or so, so definitely stay tuned to the channel because I will be covering those later on. Anyway, with the GEM now configured, we can mount it to the bracket, ensuring that we didn't forget to install the included Wi-Fi antenna. And then install this other ribbon cable, which will be connected to our full-size HDMI port. So the RetroGEM HDMI mod is now fully installed. We can now start to put things together, which brings us to our next mod, this brand new translucent sonic blue shell. I got this particular shell from Amazon, but there are other great options available for sale on the Muramasa store. So now all the hard stuff is pretty much done, and these last few mods are thankfully way easier to install. First, before we install the cooling system, I want to lubricate the fan, which should help with longevity and reduce overall noise. It's only held on with 2 screws, and once removed, we simply need to peel back the sticker here to reveal the fan bearing. I'm just going to be putting in a very small amount of this racer oil here that I typically use for cassette player repair. Some folks like to put in white lithium grease, which should also do the trick, but I feel it won't really get into all the crevices like this bearing oil does. Anyway, I once again have to credit Modsville USA here for letting me know about this repair, since unfortunately we cannot install a knock to a fan mod into these VA0 consoles like we can into other revisions. So this is the best we can do to maintain and quiet down the cooling system fan on VA0 systems. So once that's taken care of and the fan is reattached to the heatsink, we'll proceed with reinstalling the cooling system. Of course, we will be replacing the old thermal pads with some new fresh ones. I'll carefully cut the new pads to match the size of the originals and reapply them. These pads are about 1mm thick, and I've sourced high-quality thermal pads in 100 by 100mm sheets. Fantastic, we're on the home stretch, and after putting on the top RF shield, we can go ahead and attach the GDEMU drive, which actually came with this very nice plastic shroud that I already attached to the unit. I actually think this is injection molded, and really do hope it works with this VA0 system. Now, once everything is connected, we can go ahead and install the USB-C power supply. This particular unit is from Christopher at Retro Robot, and honestly looks to be great quality. He uses authentic Texas Instrument buck converters, avoiding cheap, inferior components. Since this is a Japanese Dreamcast, the original power supply operated on 100 volts. And this is actually why I'm changing out the old power supply, because this one here is universal and will work in Japan with its 100 volt standard, the US with 120 volt standard, and Europe with the 240 volt standard, eliminating any compatibility concern that I previously had. And best of all, it's USB-C and uses power delivery, so it can be powered with a small brick like this one from Ugreen or Anker. Now this part here is the controller board, and this actually came with the typical mods already done by, I'm assuming, the previous owner of this console, which includes the replacement of the original rechargeable coin battery cell with one of these carriers so you can easily swap new batteries in, as well as a replacement for the original fuse with a resettable one that can sometimes be tripped accidentally, making the controller port unusable. So while these are good mods to do for the controller board, these will actually serve, at least for the time being, as a stopgap measure because I actually wanted to install this kit here. Now, this kit was actually mailed about 2 weeks ago, but unfortunately it didn't make it in time for this video. This kit comes from a modder in Jordan who goes by the name Thundertronics. This kit is similar in that it replaces the stock clock battery and resettable fuse, but with a twist, a pretty big one. Instead of a normal coin battery, he uses a flippin' 18650 lithium-ion cell, which is sheer madness, and the main reason that I wanted to use it. This modification significantly extends the time between powering the Dreamcast on before you're prompted to reset the time and date. While extended periods of inactivity, such as being powered off for over a month, may still require you to reset, this upgrade ensures that shorter durations without powering on will retain your time and date settings. I was really looking forward to installing this, but maybe I can do it for a future video on the channel. Anyway, all we need to do now is button up the console, and we're done. So doing a build like this is always challenging, but at the end of the day, I really do think it's worth it. So let's power this thing on and see how it works. And immediately there's something not right here. So after a bit of troubleshooting, I was able to determine that the plastic shroud for the GDEMU is causing it to not seat properly on the connector, which means either I need to let it just float there, or I can search online for a solution. And thankfully, a person who goes by D4N137 uploaded a custom bracket design to the Printables website that is made specifically for the GDEMU to be installed in VA0 consoles. Remember, the GDEMU was not meant to be installed on VA0 systems, so pretty much all the brackets and shrouds that are designed for the GDEMU actually do not fit into my particular console. So I fired up the 3D printer and burned off a copy. Sure, it's not as elegant as the plastic shroud that came with the kit, but let's see if it works. So after installing it into the Dreamcast, we can now see that it does indeed boot. But I'm sure there are some puzzled looks out there because this isn't the intro of a standard Dreamcast. This custom 3D intro is all thanks to that new BIOS chip that we installed. I know it seems like a lot of work for something so trivial, but I really think it's something very cool and unique for the build and adds just that little bit of extra spice. For comparison, here is the new intro next to the original. Anyway, we of course have the GDEMU menu where we can select our games right off of our SD card. I'm not going to talk too much about this mod as it's been out there for a while and very well documented. Now, the new HDMI kit from PixelFX is pretty sweet. One of the coolest new options that we didn't previously have on the original DC Digital mod is that full-size HDMI port. That means we can now connect the console to the TV using a standard HDMI cord without the need of a micro adapter. So to activate the RetroGEM menu, simply press the L and R trigger with right on the D-pad and the B button all at the same time. Here we can see a lot of the same features from the DC Digital, such as scaling and deinterlacing options, as well as a debug and self-test mode, which helps ensure that we installed the mod correctly. But there are some new features too. This includes the increased range of output resolutions up to 1440p if you have the Shiny Edition, as well as a fully customizable scaler, allowing us to change the aspect ratio and even zoom in on the image. Now, one of the more interesting features is this, Direct Mode. This is a pretty game-changing mode in that it basically takes the pure pristine digital signal from the console and outputs it to an external scaler of your choice, such as the PixelFX Morph or the RetroTink 4K via HDMI. Connecting to an external scaler gives you more options on how you want to tweak the video to your liking. The great thing about this feature is that it's actually available in both the Shiny Edition of RetroGEM, but also the cheaper Basic Edition, which would be the more economical version to get if you do have a nice external scaling device. Overall, these RetroGEM kits are absolutely fantastic and one of my favorite mods to install in these retro consoles. The Retro Robot USB kit is also great. I love that the Dreamcast can now be powered with a USB-C cable and a tiny power delivery charger like this one from Anker or this one from Ugreen. And lastly, the shell looks absolutely fantastic. I went the extra mile by pulling the original gray power and open buttons, the Dreamcast badge, and the controller port shroud from the original console to give it a more authentic OEM look. I also transferred all the hardware for the lid, which I think feels a bit more solid and premium compared to the hardware that came with the aftermarket shell. And finally, to add that signature Macho Nacho touch, I placed a small part of my logo here on the trapezoid above the power LED. Overall, I'm thrilled with how the final result turned out. It looks incredible. But we're not done yet. We can't have a fully tricked out Dreamcast and use a wired controller, so to fix that, I actually picked up the Retro Fighter Striker Dreamcast controller. This is a great wireless solution that'll set you back around $55. However, I do have one complaint with this controller, which is that the VMU needs to be inserted into the dongle and not the controller itself. That's a bit of a bummer because some games display pretty useful information on the VMU display during gameplay. Now, while this controller works perfectly fine, I actually would have really liked to have tried another wireless controller called the DreamCon Plus that does allow you to use a VMU within the controller itself. It achieves this by using the stock Dreamcast shell, but swapping out the internals for something more modern. This seems like the dream solution for wireless gameplay with the Dreamcast, but it comes at a hefty price, about 190 euros shipped, which translates to nearly $200 US. Now, that's a tough pill to swallow, but being able to use the VMU as intended in a wireless configuration might be worth it to some. And speaking of the VMU, this brings me to the last mod, or really accessory that I got, the VM2, which is a major upgrade to the original VMU. It features a backlit display, internal rechargeable battery via USB-C, and practically unlimited storage thanks to the microSD card expansion. However, even though the VM2 does the job, I found it to be a bit of a clunky experience, which is why I'm really anticipating the release of the upcoming VMU Pro for the Dreamcast from the folks over at 8-Bit Mods. It looks really promising, and I've really bought into their ecosystem of smart memory cards. So as soon as that is released, I'll definitely be covering it here on the channel, so be sure to stay tuned for that and that you're subscribed. Oh yeah, and I can't forget to mention that we also now have replacement VMU Shells and Membranes from Video Games New York. Again, just another unique way to customize Dreamcast hardware, and I'll also leave a link to where you can find those down below in the description. Well folks, there you have it, an update to the ultimate Sega Dreamcast build. The modding community continues to do some truly incredible work, and honestly, it's getting harder and harder to keep up. That said, I think this dreamy Dreamcast setup will keep me satisfied for the foreseeable future. Now, if there's a cool Dreamcast mod that I missed, definitely let me know what it is down below in the comments, and maybe I'll cover it in a future video. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for watching, have a happy and safe holiday, and I'll catch you again next time.